Hello, my name is Rafe. I am a senior security researcher in the Secureworks Counter Threat Unit. Thank you, Alex. Appreciate the handover. So I'm here to talk to you today about Operation Rainbow Safari, a North Korean supply chain attack. I'm actually the thematic lead for Iran, but over my 15 years at Secureworks and 8 years in the CTU, the last 3 to 4 of which have been in the KIC. I've studied a number of areas, North Korea being one of them. And this was an incident that I assisted our incident response teams with in 2020. I've studied North Korean threat groups perhaps since the 2013 Dark Soul attacks. Always fascinate me as a nation state and a source of offensive cyber activity. So the nature of this presentation and the nature of the discussion really lends itself really well to the diamond model. I'm a big fan of the diamond model. For those that are not familiar, this was a model of intrusion analysis. I think the paper was written back in 2013, but the concepts have been used by the authors in the various organizations for a number of years. Essentially, they codified a number of aspects of intrusion analysis, brings together core features, particularly the adversary, capability, infrastructure, and the victim. And then these features are linked by edges that represent fundamental relationships between some of those features. And there are additional relationships described in the paper, as well as some of the analytical pivots to go from one feature to another. Really interesting paper, really worthwhile reading it if it's not one you're familiar with. So 4 key areas. We're going to start off by talking about the adversary. I'm just going to give a high-level overview of the sort of North Korean offensive cyber actor landscape. There are more organizations in North Korea that have a cyber capability than just the Reconnaissance General Bureau, but that is a main source of, or believed to be a main source of the groups that we tend to see as cyber defenders and threat researchers. So the Reconnaissance General Bureau brings together a number of aspects that's sort of similar to sort of the NSA and the CIA and FBI sort of all rolled into one. Does a wide range of things. But one of those is the technical surveillance, so Third Bureau technical surveillance, and within that, the 110th Research Center has had various names. I should point out that North Korea is a fairly impenetrable country in terms of understanding how things work, even for sort of serious government level organizations. So from a threat research perspective, we very much focus on the sort of cyber observable activity and how that sort of looks to us and how that clusters up based on the sort of 4 main aspects here described in the diamond model. So when it comes to looking at the threat research, we have these sort of groups, these cyber observable groups, the main one of which we refer to as NICKEL Academy, also known in open source as Lazarus. And there are a number of subgroups that we associate with this. One being the Nickel Gladstone or Blue Noroff group, and these folks in particular have been associated with a wide range of activities. So there was an indictment. I think it was released at the beginning of 2021, but it could have been late 2020. Either way, you can see there from the date it was sort of first submitted January 2020, and covers a range of criminal cyber activity perpetuated by these individuals on the screen and their accomplices. So everything from destructive attacks to theft and extortion to creating multiple malicious cryptocurrency applications to even developing a fraudulent blockchain platform that involved fractional ownerships of ships and things like that. So when it comes to North Korea, if there's something going, they usually have a part of it. Sort of, they're well known for the Sony Pictures Entertainment attack in 2014. Well known for WannaCry, but yeah, these folks into all sorts and a bit of a wild card when it comes to exactly what they're going to do. I mean, every time we sort of come out and talk about something they do, it seems like next year there's something even more crazy and unpredictable. So while a lot of the stuff from Nickel Academy and Nickel Gladstone is well documented, there are other smaller groups that are less in the limelight. And we had the opportunity to investigate an incident involving one of these groups, or at least activity we attribute to one of these groups that we refer to as NICKEL HYATT, also known as Andariel. So the Andariel group, or NICKEL HYATT, and there's some other open source names here, Silent Chollima, Stonefly, and Wassenite, have been operating since at least 2013, and in some cases, potentially tie back to sort of 2009. Certainly some of the very earliest attacks and activity we can attribute to North Korean operators probably involved this branch of activity. In general, this group focuses on 4 key geographies. So South Korea is a big one for all North Korean groups. There's been a lot of activity, relatively speaking, in India, in Japan, and to some extent the US. And then there are other attacks that show up in other places in the world. So we do see Western Europe, just other places. They don't necessarily constrain themselves to key geographies, but a number of these countries here are either areas that they feel they can operate in relatively freely, or sort of long-term countries that they perceive as sort of long-term adversaries in North Korea. Covers a wide range of different verticals, so everything from financial institutions to defense contractors, government agencies, academic think tanks, science and technology organizations, energy sector organizations, and North Korean defector groups all fit within the remit of NICKEL HYATT. So what's their intent? Again, unusually for sort of this kind of state-sponsored activity, but perhaps not that unusual for North Korea. We see a wide range of activity. So a lot of it's espionage, a lot of it's sort of intellectual property theft, but we also see activities for financial gain, and we also see disruptive activities. Financial gains are a big one for North Korean groups. As a country that is disconnected from the international economy, international community, quite isolated, heavily sanctioned, they look to make money anywhere they can. And we've talked about some of the ways they do that, but everything from cryptocurrency theft to literally, in the case of some of these groups like Nickel Gladstone, robbing banks in Bangladesh and other countries around the world. And obviously well known for some of the disruptive attacks. So taking us back to our diamond model here, we're going to look at the victim. So just to give you a flavor for some of the victims that NICKEL HYATT has gone after, there was a big intrusion announced in 2019 at a nuclear power plant, the Kudankulam nuclear power plant in India. Now, some people might think, well, this is a nuclear power plant. They've obviously going to have top-of-the-line security. Everything's going to be air-gapped. If an organization like this can't protect themselves, then what hope do I have? But the reality is that there may well be different levels of security in this sort of organization. But fundamentally, there is always an attack surface, and there's always that initial weak ring that a threat actor can get into in order to start working their way towards the harder targets areas. And so this was one that sort of occurred sometime in 2019. Details came out, and you can see here a couple of tweets discussing this. First of all, kind of one in September, around the time when this was first reported to the Indian authorities, and then later on in October when malware sort of leaked out into the public domain that indicated that this attack had occurred, and the whole sort of discussion happened in the public domain. What was interesting about this is that the malware involved in this attack, or at least one of the pieces of malware involved in this attack, was known as DTrack, also known as PREFT. And this is a sort of a modular framework of malware, covers a variety of different, the name covers a variety of different sort of permutations. This particular sample that was appeared to be configured to use credentials taken from KKNPP, or the nuclear power plant, had been compiled in July. The incident was sort of publicly acknowledged in October, so the actual intrusion perhaps occurred some point within that sort of time frame. DTrack itself has been in use for a number of years, at least back to 2018. Potentially some of the earlier PREFT variant samples back to 2016. What was interesting though is that a sample that I identified from 2018 was using this domain katawaku.jp for command and control, and this domain was actually still in use by the threat actors in 2020, which seemed like an unusually long life for infrastructure. So using this for over 2 years at least in their operations. So what is Operation Rainbow Safari? From my perspective, it was the incident we worked in one particular organization. I think more generally, there were a number of organizations in a sort of particular geography that were compromised as part of this campaign. There was other third-party reporting that came out that discussed other targets that weren't the one that we were aware of. So there seemed to be a number of different organizations, mostly focused in sort of East Asia, that were being targeted, and generally speaking, sort of science, technology type organizations. So in our particular case, the victim identified some activity. It was an EDR control within the victim's environment that first spotted this activity, that something was amiss. Once we delved into the incident, once the incident response was kicked off, we identified that credentials had been taken. Threat actors come in, sort of obtain credentials. They deployed custom malware to a number of systems within the environment. They conducted activity to sort of orientate themselves within the network, and also tried to exfiltrate data that would help them better understand the network and where key assets were. Unfortunately, this was detected at quite an early stage, and so no critical or sensitive information was exfiltrated from the environment. But we still got to see an interesting amount of tradecraft from the threat actors within their environment, which is a hugely valuable insight. It gives us insight into things that we can't get just by analyzing the infrastructure. We can't get just by analyzing the malware. It tells us about how the actual human threat actors operate when they're within a target environment, the things they prefer to do, the mistakes they prefer, sorry, not the mistakes they prefer to make, but the mistakes that they do make when they're there. So what was interesting about this particular incident is that it wasn't the threat actor hadn't come in through a phish, or hadn't exploited something within the organization's perimeter. After working for a period of time, responders figured out that actually the threat actors come in through a business-to-business connection related to a partner organization that this particular company, our client, our customer, worked with. We identified a bastion host where the threat actors had established a beachhead and used that to conduct initial credential attacks and initial probing into the environment. And so while most of the victim environment was sort of Windows boxes, this particular bastion host was a Linux device that the threat actors were using to bridge into the environment. Working back from there, it was discovered that the third party's environment was in fact the origin of the compromise. The threat actors had compromised a host in the DMZ in this company, had figured out that there was a number of these sort of bastion host boxes that they could bridge into other organizations, and they pivoted into the intermediate environment and into the ultimately into the victim's environment that we were studying and responding to. So that takes us from the victim to the capability. So what did we see? What do we see being deployed within the victim environment? So one of the earliest things that tipped us off and tipped the EDR solution off to this activity was these entries in the Windows event logs. I've slightly modified this to redact some of the key information, but bottom line is we have some interesting service names here. This unusual name, BTO, account running its local system, and in the log entry you see a series of commands being run. There's some things being echoed, outputs being redirected. There's batch files being executed. So we're sort of trying to figure out what is going on here. And so lots of these SMB requests coming out from the Bastion host into the environment. And it turns out a little bit of investigation, figure out this tool is smbexec.py. You can see in the top right-hand corner there an extract of some of the code from this tool. It's available on GitHub, freely downloadable. we can see there that some of those file names and batch file names and other variables match exactly, like the service name there, match exactly what we were seeing in that Windows event log. And obviously, the author of the tool themselves actually point out that this is to be expected. Even in the notes from this tool, they say, keep in mind that although this technique might help in avoiding antivirus, there are a lot of event logs generated, and that is true. Lots of event logs were generated and let us detect at a relatively early stage that this threat actor was entering and moving about the environment. So what else did they do with SMB exec? Well, they were using it in conjunction with RAR utility, so command line version of WinRAR they put into the environment. Again, WinRAR is not native to Windows environments, so if you don't use this tool internally within your enterprise, it's a really easy way to potentially detect anomalous activity, potentially detect files being compressed and staged for exfiltration. Definitely one to look out for. Very, very sort of simple thing, but just the fact that you don't normally have this deployed can be very helpful. The threat actors operated out of the C Windows temp directory, likely due to it being sort of out of the way and not something that people would look at on a regular basis, and also the fact that the permissions might have enabled them to operate with a low privilege account initially. Tended to use short file names for their tools, 1 to 3 characters, would just rename things to make it easy for them to type and to execute. Sometimes they used passwords with the RAR archive, sometimes they didn't. Passwords are always very interesting and enlightening sort of thing to capture, particularly sort of adversary passwords, and help us sort of cluster activity over different intrusions. Another tool we recovered from the environment was known as PuttyLink or Plink. This is commonly used by multiple threat groups for creating sort of encrypted tunnels into and out of the environment. It has the benefit of being a standard administration tool, part of the Putty suite of SSH tools. But again, if it's not something that you use in your environment, that you're not expected to be present, it can be a good indicator that something unusual is occurring and worth following up the activity you see around the deployment and use of this tool. So we found this in the environment, used for encrypting tunnels, as I said. Potentially they created a sort of a custom compile version of this, and within the environment, they were calling this tool plbhost.exe. So no guarantees that will be sort of one that they'll continue to use, but potentially a file name indicator to go looking for within the environment. Another tool we found very quickly is known as 3Proxy. So this was interesting, partly because when we analyzed the 2019 nuclear power plant intrusion, we didn't have first-hand access to the environment or the telemetry. We just saw malware samples and other bits of infrastructure that were linked to that incident. But some of the ports that were hard-coded into the malware for the malware to communicate on internally to internal systems indicated that 3Proxy might be in use. It was the default port for 3Proxy. So this is something we'd associate with this group and something our incident responders could look for when they went into the environment and very quickly found it. So it's an example of one of those ways that threat intelligence can help you short circuit an incident response engagement and find things more quickly than you may have otherwise. So this can be run without installing itself as a service. It's got this sort of daemon mode. And again, they seem to be running a development build, potentially suggesting that either they tweaked it a little bit to try and avoid any hash matching, or maybe sort of attempted to add additional functionality or make it work better with some of their other tools. North Koreans spend a lot of time developing new tools and making open source tools work with their tooling. One of the custom pieces of malware we found within that environment was known as what we called the gift horse info stealer. This was kind of a variant of DTrack that was optimized for info stealing, written in C++, delivered using a dropper that sort of masqueraded or was structured around a benign Microsoft Foundation class application. But the code in that application was modified slightly to load some shellcode. That shellcode unpacked and decrypted a resource which contained the payload, and then loaded that payload directly into memory. So the file you get on disk isn't actually the final payload that gets injected into memory. And again, this is, I think, one way they try to circumvent analysis and detection. This particular piece of malware configured to profile the infected host, and interestingly, it would enumerate the contents of the attached hard drives or storage devices. It goes through, puts lists of files into this file you see here. So it's app data local temp, named it based on the IP address, or create a directory based on the IP address of the host, and put it in this C temp tilde file, which sort of contained like a serialized C structure, possibly because they're going to take this data and feed it into some backend system that helps them generate a view of the environment, potentially. So once that had been created, it was compressed using pkzip, and then copied to a file in the temp directory there that used a file name that matched that pattern. So that AB1234E for F is not one of the file names, but it matched that sort of general regular expression that I put there. The files themselves within the compressed archive could be configured to be encrypted with a password, and then also they'd stick a password on the compressed archive itself. In this, and then the final step of the malware, and where the sort of name comes from, was the change of the header file to be the sort of magic number, or the magic bytes associated with a GIF file, potentially to sort of camouflage the file while it was on disk, and then they would come along and exfiltrate the data at some point, a later point. They seem to take a number of steps to try and obfuscate their activity. The steps they choose to take is kind of, again, an interesting insight into their psychology and what they think defenders are looking for. Veil4Rat was another piece of custom malware we recovered from the environment. This was interesting because we'd received a notification from the UK NCSC a little while before discussing a sample of this, so clearly had been in the wild for a little while. Again, this was a payload injected directly into memory using a similar sort of dropper as we saw with Gift Horse. File names range from the very pronounceable resmanager.exe to the very unpronounceable other file name you see there. Veil4 provides basic remote access Trojan functionality. You've got file upload and download capabilities, arbitrary command execution, and the ability to sort of execute plugins, but in the form of sort of other executables that it can download and run, or scripts, I think VB script and one other scripting language, and also sort of execute shellcode that is pushed down to it. So it very much provides this sort of initial beachhead and way of running other commands and other binaries on the system. What was interesting was the way it communicated. So it had a number of different URLs hard-coded into the binary. At the top two here, which I refer to as the primary and secondary C2, and then we have these other four URLs. We'll discuss those in a little bit, but that was something that piqued my interest very early on, this unusual sort of naming convention that we see with those domains. Last but not least, they attempted to obfuscate some of them. So some of these were just pushed down as sort of two megabyte binaries. Others were zero padded out to 50 megs. I think this was likely an attempt to sort of evade AV, as AV solutions often have a limit on the size of file that they will upload to the cloud to analyze. And so by padding it out to a large file size, you can potentially avoid that. Veil4 has some very detectable C2 traffic. I'd call attention to the accept parameter here. So this text/HTML1 is actually used to communicate to the C2 server the sort of step that the malware is on. So that value there can be 1, 2, 3. I think initially it will start off as either 0 or be absent. But looking for an anomaly like that is a great way to detect traffic here. Also looking for these parameters that we see in the URI. So you've got UFW equals and the UIS equals parameters that both communicate information back to the command and control about that particular infected host, but both make useful sort of points for network traffic detection. We also found another piece of malware in the environment known as what we called UnitBot, also now known in open source as the Veil4 beta. This was written in Delphi, so different from the sort of C++ rats we saw before. Also known as helper.exe or access theme.exe within the environment. Also provided sort of basic remote access, Trojan functionality, execute arbitrary commands, file upload and download, and also this this sort of system profiling functionality. So you can see some of the strings output there, where it would use those format strings to generate reports that would send back to the C2 about the infected host, what users were present, that kind of stuff. Unibot used a different beacon style to Veil 4 itself, but again, we see things like katawaku.jp, that infrastructure I talked about before, and just the general sort of structure here, things like content length 0, the order of headers, the post request to a .php page, make it very sort of signable from a network detection perspective. So that brings us on to infrastructure. So as I mentioned in the last slide or the slide before that, two types of domains were in use. So we had this set of domains that looked very much like compromised infrastructure. Certainly these were real websites. They hosted a lot of other content, but particular pages on these sites were used as command and control for the malware deployed in the target network. We then had this set of secondary infrastructure, which followed this sort of coloranimal.com theme. But when I looked into it, they're sort of all over the shop in terms of registration dates. Some of these are very old. A number of these are certainly legitimate websites. One of these, for example, is a US based dairy ice cream company. And it just doesn't seem like the threat actor operates or controls any of these domains. So whether the plan is to potentially compromise these on demand if their rats are unable to communicate with the existing C2 infrastructure, or whether they're using these for some other reason, it's unclear. But this use of this infrastructure and the ability to then look for sort of color animal themed domains within network traffic is a strong sort of telltale sign of this malware in this group. It also reminded me of the Gold Dragon campaign that McAfee had documented. Now, there's no technical links here of both North Korean actors, but the Gold Dragon campaign, totally different group, different actor, different malware. But they also included a reference to a coloranimal.com domain, which wasn't used for command and control in this malware. It was embedded in the strings, but not used for anything. Okay, so that brings us to the end of that story there, completed the diamond model. But in terms of the sort of so what's and the takeaways, I think the main thing here is that we have a supply chain attack that's not one of the sort of super sophisticated, long-term, complicated operations like we saw with SolarWinds. It's not even something like MEDOC and that sort of compromise that led to the NotPetya incident. We have a much more sort of run-of-the-mill supply chain attack using one organization and the trusted access that organization has to get to another organization. And this is much more the sort of things that most organizations will face day to day when it comes to supply chain attacks. We've seen lots of different groups over time using this tactic, and it's likely to persist into the future. So being aware of all of your third-party access into your environment, making sure that it's restricted, and there's effective network segmentation, effective filtering, and where appropriate, you've got multi-factor authentication. All of those sort of controls are necessary for, and also just sort of risk assessment of other access from that business connection. Also, despite the fact this is a nation-state APT group, as we've seen, Tracar can be noisy and easily detectable. Looking for those anomalous tools deployed in your environment, looking for those indications of the malware and the custom malware that they use makes it really easy to detect these sort of actors. But you must have holistic visibility across your environment, across the endpoints, network, cloud, other critical log sources in order to be collecting the information that lets you conduct that sort of detection at an early stage. And lastly, you'll be able to go back and see the recordings of these, but go back, check your networks using the indicators I provided during the presentation. As we've seen, some of this infrastructure is used for a long period of time. It may be you find a latent compromise within your network. Who knows? Okay, that is everything I had for today. Thank you for listening.